All right, before we move on, I'd like to cover another example of how to derive Newtonian gravity that I came across not long after I finished the last lecture on the subject. And its work, it's not its starting point, but the crux of it is this expression, which you may remember is how we derived an intuitive understanding of the Ricci tensor, right? There's the Ricci tensor right there. And the idea was that the Ricci tensor is a way of expressing how a volume element that's free falling or moving through space-time the volume element's volume will accelerate in size, either get smaller or bigger, different than it would in flat space. And this difference, the difference in the acceleration of the volume element's volume, in curved spacetime versus flat spacetime is expressed through the Ricci tensor. And that's how we interpreted the Ricci tensor. So that was kind of cool. This volume element is presumably moving in this direction with a force velocity t mu, right? So if I know the direction that this volume element is moving, I think the idea is you assume the volume element is like full of little particles and they're all moving with a force velocity of t mu. So they kind of start out parallel in the space-time. And then you take that force velocity, you contract fully with the Ricci tensor, and the size of the volume, which is presumed to be small, right? That the size of the volume times that number represents the acceleration of the volume. So that's kind of interesting. So we can broker this to derive Newtonian gravity as well. And the way it works is the following. We begin with the Einstein equation in the trace reversed form, which we talked about at the end of, or in the second part of the last lecture. Very simple process of converting the Einstein equation into this form. It just leans a little bit more heavily on the mass energy or the stress energy tensor, or the energy momentum tensor, I guess is the best way to say it. These things all have these different names. You got to track different books, use different names. We're throwing in the 8 pi g here now. This was k before. In principle, you could use this logic to derive this number, but now that we know it, let's just put it in there. This process is good to be a second review of this whole Newtonian limit because we know the techniques, for example, the trace reverse tensor. So the first thing we do is we're looking at this trace reversed Einstein equation, and we're going to contract it with the force velocity of we're going to be exploring a small sphere of dust, right? Just like we did with the interpretation of the Ricci tensor. So there's a small sphere of dust out there in space-time, and we are going to explore its velocity. And we're assuming that it starts with a velocity of t mu nu, or t mu, right? That's its force velocity. And every particle is parallel in motion with a small force velocity of t mu. And the volume of this little ball of dust is, well, it's some finite volume actually, right? It's some volume, right? Some small volume. But anyway, the first step we do is we contract this trace reversed expression. And let's see what we get here when we do that. This is the contraction, so we're going to contract with, on this side here, with the tensor, and then here as well, and here as well. Now, clearly what's going to happen here is g mu nu, t nu, that's going to track to the magnitude of t. Now, we assume that this initial vector t is a unit, right, unit length. So this is going to come out to be 1. So that factor just goes away and becomes 1. Here, notice that I'm using t, I'm overloading t. This is the energy momentum tensor, and this is a force velocity. And you know that it's different because it has a different index structure, which means this is a vector, that's a tensor. This really isn't ambiguous, right? The use of t in both circumstances is not ambiguous because of the index structure. So the symbol t is overloaded a little bit here, but that's fine. I want to stick with it. I guess, so we execute this contraction. And the way this works is when we're when we're moving with the dust, right? And when our laboratory is moving with the this little ball of dust, and we're in the non-relativistic limit, as usual, the only thing that matters is the mass density. That overwhelms everything, right? The pressures are low, the momentum transfers are low. Everything's low inside the stress energy tensor. This guy has got everything small. So these contractions, the only thing that survives is one term, and that's the matter density. So the matter density is all that's left. And therefore, when you subtract rho from 1/2 rho, so this trace, in other words, this becomes 1. This trace, the only, or this full contraction, only thing that survives is the matter density. And here, that calculation, the only thing that survives is T00. 0. And there you have it. So you have just the straight up matter density. And you end up with this expression here, 4 pi g rho. And then here you have here you have the expression that lands on the right side of this expression, our interpretation expression. So we know that this is a factor that tells us how quickly this sphere is going to accelerate in size more than it would in a flat space-time. So we're in the non-relativistic limit, and so we're still trying to compare the curvature of space's influence on the acceleration of growth of our little sphere versus what would happen if there was no gravity. But you can speculate about free space and space with gravity in Newtonian physics as well, right? You just say in the presence or in the absence of some planet, right? In the absence of a planet, you have this term. In the presence of the planet, you have this, right? And the difference between the two is the effect of the planet on the acceleration of this object. So this is still okay. This is telling us, though, that how is gravity going to literally affect the size of our falling or moving? Well, it's in free fall, right? So it is falling, but it's got this initial motion that's described by t, and t is this vector where it all starts, right? The initial motion of our thing, but the subsequent motion is guided by geodesic free fall, right? The geodesic paths of each of the dust particles. That's what constitutes the volume of this object, right? So we go back and have a look at our expression here, and now we replace this side of it with 4 pi g rho, right? That's what this told us. So we can now express that as 4 pi g rho. And now we can integrate the thing, right? The integration is over a sphere. So we're going to now turn this delta volume in this expression to a real volume by integrating over some sphere. And on this side, integrating this over a sphere, the 4 pi g comes out, integrating the density, which is a function of space, right, over small volumes of a sphere, right, that is going to give us the mass, the total mass enclosed by the sphere. And likewise, over here, we're just going to get del volume over the sphere. We're just going to get the volume itself of the sphere. So this part here is the mass enclosed by the sphere. That's the result of this integral. Over here now, we're taking the second derivative with respect to time of the volume of the sphere. Now this is the volume of the sphere in its second derivative with respect to time. This is sort of the true volume of the sphere in the sense that in the presence of gravity, this is the way the volume of the sphere accelerates. Now, if a sphere's radius is getting bigger, its volume is going to get bigger too, but it's not linear. It's actually, the volume does accelerate. So if every little particle is sort of moving away from each other radially, say, just imagine the sphere sort of exploding, right? The volume is clearly going to grow, but it's not going to grow linearly as the particles just move away. Each particle may have a constant velocity away from the center. The sphere is going to grow non-linearly with respect to that radius because the volume grows as the cube of the radius. So anyway, the full expression for this is this expression here. As the radius of the sphere changes with time, right, the volume changes with this 8 pi r dot squared term. And if the radius is actually accelerating, right, if the radial particles are, if the radius is accelerating in size, then the volume of the sphere, the volume of the sphere picks up an acceleration term. This is the second derivative of 4/3 pi r cubed, right? This is the second derivative of 4/3 pi r cubed, where r is a function of time. Now, the flat space version of that is this. It's the same expression, except r double dot is 0 in the flat space version, right? In flat space, the particles would be moving at a constant velocity. There's nothing to cause the particles to accelerate from one another. It's a little bit heuristic here. That's why that's why I'm glad I didn't use this for the last lecture. But the idea is, for this part, this term here is 0. But for this part, the second term does survive, and so the subtraction takes those two parts out, and the only thing left is the contribution of the acceleration due to radial acceleration, right? So that leaves this final expression here, right? The mass enclosed, 4 pi g, mass enclosed, 4 pi r squared, and then you have this acceleration term. And then the next step is obvious. You have the acceleration, r, is minus gm over r squared. And there's Newtonian gravity all back into it. Now notice what would have happened if we had started with this being just k, right? K, then this would have been k over 2. I'm kind of winging it here, right? This would have been k over 2 here. This would have been k over 2. This would have been k over 2. This would have been k over 2. And we would have landed with this expression here would have been it would have been something like this, right? And then I think if we had chose, and then so now we want to duplicate not the geodesic equation or the Poisson equation. Now we just want to achieve the force law. So to get the force law, we would need, I think, let's see if I can get this right. I think this would, if this was 8 pi g, if k was 8 pi g, then this 2 would cancel and you'd get a 4. The pi's would cancel, the 4's would cancel, and you'd get left over with gm. Yeah, so that would work. So you could have, if you had bought into this heuristic here, which I think makes sense. I mean, nothing's wrong about this. It just doesn't go into the beautiful gory detail that I liked from the other one. But you get there, and it lands right here in the Einstein equation, right? The fact that it's trace reversed does not affect the constant k. Okay, so that was a little extra demonstration. Now let's move on. You know, on review of this lecture, one thing I did notice that was kind of interesting is this expression here, right? What I said is in the frame of the dust. When you do this calculation, you get rho. And in the frame of the dust, when you do this calculation, you get rho, the energy density. Now, notice what's important about that is you could use any 4 vector here. The dust can be moving in relative to the observer in any way that you want. The point is if you go into the frame of the dust, the calculation is really simple and it's obvious to see why it's rho. But the key takeaway there, the lesson, the teaching moment here is that this is a full tensor equation. These are tensor indices. These are tensor indices. You're contracting. That's all tensor manipulation. So if you can calculate this in any given frame and get a scalar, then that scalar is going to be the answer regardless of what this initial 4 vector is, right? In other words, all you're doing is a Lorentz transformation on T, right? And therefore, if the calculation in one frame is rho, then then you'll get rho in any frame. It'll just be a much more complicated analysis, but you'll get there. So so don't think that somehow this is only valid in the frame of reference of the dust. It's just that's the one that's kind of easy to think about. But if it's true in one frame, it's true in every frame. So if it's true in the frame of the dust, then you do a Lorentz transformation of this expression to some other frame, you're still going to get rho in the end. All the other terms of this are going to either cancel, go away. They'll still be limiting to zero under certain circumstances, and you'll be left with the energy density under the same assumptions. Okay, so I think we're done with the Newtonian limit stuff here. Now it's time to attack the Schwarzschild equation, Schwarzschild spacetime in the next